Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen, and this is a program where we talk to all manner of people who are working and living in Boston, sometimes passing through Boston, who are engaged in research, maybe academics, maybe working as consultants, activists, poets, researchers, people who are engaged with, if you like, the media and communication space, and who are also engaged quite frequently in the challenges facing those of us who live in a society that presents plenty of challenges in the communication environment and in society in general. So today I'm delighted to welcome two guests, Calvin and Zofia, and they are from the T4TReading group, and we're going to learn more about T4T. T stands, as I understand it, for transsexual. Is that correct?
Transgender.
Transgender, there you go. See, I'm wrong to start with. Could have been an intentional mistake just to help make the point. But the point is that as a cis male, I have to recognise, and I want to recognise, the importance of what social movements mean to the opening up of society and to the possibilities of a society that's just and that's reasonable. So I wanted to just start by talking about my own understandings of transgender transitions, if you like, or transgender history. And I experienced it at three levels. At the first, I suppose, really serious considerations I gave to it was in the 1970s and 1980s through the media. And that was watching the movies of Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who was a great, wonderful German filmmaker, and particularly his movie Querelle, which came out in 1982, was quite shocking to me. It was about a gay sailor, and wonderfully engaging, but also for a cis male in Australia, terrifying what to make of this. But suddenly it was, well, not suddenly, but it was clear that there was another world, a different kind of world that people inhabited, and they had as much a right to dignity as the rest of us. So that was the first point I'd make about, as a cis male, coming in contact with that different world through media. The second one was more recently, and it was with through my friend and colleague Mackenzie Walk, who put together this book. Mackenzie and I met in Australia many, many years ago. Mackenzie now works in and lives in New York City, has for a long time. He's at the New School, and this memoir of his describes, or hers, describes his transition to being a woman or a transgender woman. I'm not sure that I'm actually describing that correctly, but it's a fascinating and somewhat heartbreaking example of the challenges faced by people in that situation. So that was the second example that I wanted to give, and trying to develop my own consciousness of this situation. And the third one was simply the observations of what's happened in US and global society generally. And I suppose I would make the point that historically the biggest shift in understanding what happens in what we might think of as the gender wars was the 2015 introduction of what was called Respect for Marriage Act, which was in fact the opportunity given by the Obama administration to enable gay people to be married, whether they were cis men or cis women or whatever they were. And it seemed to me that opened the floodgates to a very valuable set of opportunities for discussing these things, and also offering rights to those who were in the trans community. So that, of course, brings us to the question of the guests for today, and I wanted to start probably on a sort of a slightly heavier note before we maybe get to a little bit lighter note, and that is to actually ask you about what it's like to be engaged, let's say, in a community where there's very clearly a political element to it. You know, it's very clearly an element of struggle. It's not normal in the sense in which the vast majority of people in society would see sexuality as being normal. So I know that's a big area to start with, but do you have any ways of perhaps opening up the conversation? Zofia or Calvin, what do you think?
Well, I think that the trans community is forcibly politicized because there is pressure from the outside. For me, I transitioned 12, or actually more, like socially closer to 14, 15 years ago, which is a while because a lot has changed regarding LGBT rights and a lot has changed regarding LGBT culture in that time. But when I was first transitioning, the big issue was gay marriage, politically in a mainstream way, and a lot of the funding was going towards that, and a lot of the attention was going towards legalizing gay marriage, which is completely fine and reasonable because it was insane to be excluding sexual minorities from all of the many legal and financial benefits that married people get. But the sense I had coming out as trans was that we were an embarrassment because it was just too out there. And the message you got was like, if you guys could just be quiet, let us get gay marriage, let us get anti-discrimination acts, and we'll come back for you.
Oh, really?
And within the trans community, I would say a fair amount of trepidation and resentment about that, of feeling like our needs weren't centered, especially when trans people were at such a higher risk for discrimination and at such a higher risk for violence, especially trans women, especially trans women of color, especially sex workers. And we're marginalized and pushed into this smaller segment of society. And then also even within the mainstream queer community, marginalized again because it was just considered too much of a push. And so I think that just being out at that time, and Sophia is more knowledgeable about a younger, more recent trans community than I am, but I think still just being out of the closet felt inherently political. It felt like just living your life and coming out and transitioning was a political act, and I think it still is. And now politics has shifted pretty dramatically again, where before, when I was first coming out, I think trans people weren't viewed as a massive social threat. They were seen as something distasteful and weird and a little bit freak showy and a joke in so many movies. I mean, like, trans people are a throwaway joke in so many of the movies I grew up with as a kid in pop culture, and not necessarily worthy of full rights and respect, but not scary. And since this last election, I really think we've been elevated into full scapegoat, and there is a wider and extremely misinformed public opinion now that's concerned with trans people. So that's what I've got. I'll pass it off to you.
Sophia, all right, let's hear from you.
Totally. To everything you just said. I think what first came to my mind is that, yes, and I don't feel that within my net of trans community, net of trans friends and lovers and blah, 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 we are always thinking about how it's really heavy, in a lot of ways. And I think what you said to start being led into the politics of trans identity, it is heavy and devastating, and also so are so many things that happen in our personhood life that do but also don't have to fully do with just being trans in the world. And I think they're there's just so much to grieve all the time. But I think, it's heavy, and God, we try to find joy sometimes, somewhere. That's the first thing I thought of when you asked that.
And it's clearly, and I appreciate you sharing that, clearly the space in which there's an enormous emotional register, partly because it's political, right? Political as a sort of force of antagonism, right? So of course there's going to be this sort of sense of permanent grief, and as you said, the disproportionate amount of violence directed at trans women, transgender sex workers, and so on. That's pretty well known, and I understand that the kind of emotional wounds that one carries are going to be different. It seems to me, to the cis community or the dominant community. Is that going too far? Or, I mean, not to make a sort of create a martyrdom either of it.
Yeah, I think when I said like there's so much to grieve, I meant just like being a person is really hard. Like any sort of person is really hard, and that like life is so wide and rich, and being trans is a part of that. And there's so many other things that like go into being a person.
Right, that's beautiful. And you mentioned community.
Yeah.
In your comments, and the first time I came into contact with you was through the T4T reading group, or writing group, reading and writing, because you read and you write, don't you? So perhaps it would be useful to have an insight into how that community works as a mechanism to provide a kind of moral and personal kind of safeguards, if you like, for those folk like yourselves in and around Boston.
Do you want to go?
You can go.
This is the challenge with having two guests.
Is one to talk. So T4T Readings is a monthly open mic and reading series that is held out of a dive bar in Boston, Massachusetts. I started it about a year and a half ago. For multiple reasons, one of which completely personally, I'm a writer. It's a very solitary occupation, and I really enjoy having some kind of community connection and interactive element of the work. So you remember there's people who read literature and who care about it, and people you can be in conversation with, which is so beautiful and valuable. And partially because trans culture is thriving. Like trans culture is really booming. I don't think that has been noticed very often by the larger culture, because what the larger culture tends to consume is media directed at them. And there's plenty of trans memoirs off the top of my head I can think of that are written for cisgender audiences to create empathy, to give them a sense of what's going on. But there's also a ton of culture that's being created by queer and trans people for their community, for people within that community. And art is thriving. There's so much. And New York City, I know of multiple trans literary events and trans literary publishers, but very few things outside of New York. And trans people do live in places other than Brooklyn. And I wanted to bring some of that to Boston. There's so many wonderful trans writers just in Massachusetts, and so many in commuting distance of Massachusetts, including all those writers in Brooklyn. And I wanted to start something that would showcase the trans literary culture that's happening. It really feels like a renaissance. There's so much going on. There's so much richness, so many people working. And also gave a spot for people in Boston or in commuting distance of Greater Boston to come and have in-person community for like burgeoning writers to share their work at the open mic, to bring those writers into Boston and get people an opportunity to actually talk to them and interface with them, which is one of the reasons we chose to do it in a bar, because of that more casual environment where you do have like really wonderful, really talented and big hitting trans writers coming, and they're seeing the work of, you know, maybe more emerging writers in their early 20s being performed, and they can talk afterwards in the Q&A, they can talk after the event. And so it's letting the culture grow right there in person.
Wonderful. And the idea of growing a culture is very important in the sense in which it has to be actively engaged with in order to grow it. So you're one important element, I think, of that. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think also just having a set date. I mean, every like second Thursday of the month, like having a set date where if you're trans and you like literary things just in general, or like you just want to be around trans people, it's like, you know, it's gonna happen. You know where you can go, and you can go for free. And it truly is being in a room surrounded by other trans people. And I think that piece and just knowing that that's kind of like what you are walking into the space with has like brought people in and kept people coming, like along with all the like literary yumminess, like it's also who's in the room, and connecting with people in that way too.
Right. Yeah, connection is very important. I want to back up a little bit to something you said, Kelvin, about a renaissance. Was there a point in time that you're aware of where there was more activity across the trans community within the United States, or are we seeing something new? I'm just going, perhaps a little pedantic, but going back to the idea that there might have been a time in the past where there were more trans people, and then there was a transformation in mainstream culture to say we don't want this, and we're not going to allow this kind of thing to be normalised. Is it possible that we're seeing a shift?
I just think in queer art, there's definitely been points, and trans people have been part of the queer art that's come out in the past. And there've been like blossomings. Off the top of my head, I can think of a lot that was coming out.
Do you want to give a couple of examples?
In the 80s in New York, I'm thinking of all the people in the downtown scene, some of whom have now transitioned and are writing about that, like Lucy Sant. I'm thinking of all the people associated with ACT UP and all of the activism and culture that came around that, like David Wojnarowicz, people who were interacting with and working with trans people, or, you know, Candy Darling coming out in the Warhol era. And never anything, though, explicitly for trans people. Trans literature, when I was growing up, kind of, as far as I was aware, began and ended with Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues. Other things were made. The things I've found were mostly self-published because nobody wanted to touch it.
Right.
And now there's an explosion. There's many small presses dealing with trans issues. There's trans people publishing with major presses, and some of those have broken into mainstream bestseller status, like Tori Peters' Detransition Baby. We have people like Mackenzie who are in academia and theory going. There's definitely celebrity memoirs. Elliot Page's Page Boy, I think, has gotten quite a lot of attention.
That's a good number of examples.
Yes, that's a lot of examples.
I didn't mean to start you on a slippery slope of just citing all the examples, but that's great. It's wonderful to know, you know, where watchers and viewers can say, okay, well, we can go and look at that, and go and have some real concrete material about that. What about transphobia? How does what you're engaged with as being out, as being public, as being engaged in writing and being with your community represent a shift, hopefully a public shift, against transphobia, which seems very present now in this first couple of months of the Trump administration, Trump 2 administration? Is there something that might be worth discussing there, or, you know, in the sense in which let's live in hope that the fear of transgender is something that we can see society addressing and reducing?
So I'd say T4T is very much within the community and for the community. Transphobia is the bogeyman outside.
Okay.
And so transphobia is the thing, it's the political background we exist in. It's the thing that's happening in people's daily lives. But this specific space is really for trans people and trans allies. It's definitely not only trans people there, but that's who's being centered. And it's a place that's a reprieve because you can be there around the community and you know you're not going to have to deal with the transphobia from outside. And it's also a place to process and show what's come out of the engagement with it in your life, because that obviously comes up in people's writing and in people's artwork. So I think that the hopeful side is we've set up T4T to a point that we do pay our visiting artists who are coming, our features, and we're able to do that because we have grant funding through Boston and the state of Massachusetts.
Oh, really?
And the fact
That's great.
that an explicitly trans literary organization is able to get funding from a city and a state, I think that represents progress, and that represents some civic values that are countering the fear-mongering that's happening so intensively right now.
Yeah, definitely. I did have something in response, and I totally think I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I think, no, that's all right. Transphobia is a puzzle to me, frankly, as a cisgendered male, because it just seems to me to be so unnecessary. Right?
Yeah. I remembered what I was going to
Great.
say.
All right.
I think another piece is that we talked about this sort of the other day, that like T4T is like not on TikTok, like is not like active, super active, like trying to like gain more and more necessarily people to view online or in person. Yes, I think there's like a sense of come to this, be with us. But online, I think it like, we haven't really gone and tried to have like too much of a social media presence. And I think that does a lot for like having the physical space be what it is.
Yeah, right. That's important. And of course, the way that any non-standardized traditional gender is presented in the mainstream, I suspect, is intentionally negative and destructive. So I can understand the intentionality of limiting the community to the community without wanting to be proselytizing, which is part of the critique, right? That an unnecessary critique, but the critique is real in the sense in which the conservative movement especially says that what you represent, what the trans movement represents, is a way of polluting society against the gender binaries, which are pretty reactionary to say the least.
Yeah, and I think representing it as a movement, like as if there's leaders, you know what I mean? Like as if there's a 10-point plan and people elected, and it's not just a set of people with a different gendered experience.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Beautifully said, and I think also it's probably very clearly the case that the whole development of conspiracy theories and so on feeds into this, which is really just feeding into ignorance, right? Conspiracy is nothing more than an idea that emerges out of ignorance, right? This might be something, right? When it's really not. How about your connections outside of T4T as a relatively small reading group meeting in a, what do you call it, a dive bar?
Yeah.
Does that sort of meet some sort of stereotype that you're going to send people, into the bunker or something?
Yeah.
But seriously, how does that then move in, if we think sort of sociologically, to connect with communities elsewhere, not only in the United States, not only maybe outside of Boston, but in Massachusetts, but then globally? How's that sense of claiming a purpose and moving beyond the grief that's associated not with just life, but with being trans in a non-trans or anti-trans environment? And how do you make those global or regional or other connections, and how important might they be?
I would say the series feeds the writing, and the writing is published and accessible everywhere.
Right. Yeah.
And that connects all over, and I've had things published And it's shocking where they wind up, and it's shocking who talks to you later and who's read things and has opinions. And every once in a while I'll get an email from some random part of the world, and they have a thought about, my trans essay. Wonderful. And that's interesting. It goes so much further than I would ever anticipate.
Yeah, I think too about globally having money through grants to pay people who are not in America to come to the US and read. Theoretically that'll be so awesome to have enough funding to bring people to the dive bar.
Yeah, well, and there's there's well organised opposition, and I didn't know that there was funding for you from within the state of Massachusetts. So it really does reflect quite well, doesn't it, on those who are interested in the progressive side of politics, to say this is something that's beneficial to a community that otherwise may not have the opportunity to actually have a sense of community. That's great. I notice our time is just about up, unfortunately. I'm wondering if there's anything else that comes to mind as we've thought about these questions that you wanted to make a comment on or think about, help the audience to think about in terms not only of writing but in terms of how life is for a trans person.
I would say that the trans culture is thriving. And one of the best things people could do is look into it and materially support it. There are trans filmmakers making incredible movies. There's writers putting out books. Whatever interest you have, there's video game designers. I do have a universalist sensibility where I think that there's a point that really good art will transcend demographic boundaries, and you can relate to characters outside of your immediate experience. It's worth looking into the art being made because it will give a deeper understanding of those experiences, but also humanity, another human.
Absolutely, yeah. Sophia?
I think I work with middle school aged kids, and the trans kids are so deeply in love with and happy to be and so excited to keep discovering themselves in a trans way. They are so proud and so in love with that part of themselves, and there's such a deep curiosity just to know more and to connect with other trans adults and trans kids in their communities. And I think seeing that and working with those kids is very, it's just nice to be in community with kids too, who are growing in different ways than me. And trans kids are awesome and they deserve everything.
Right. Well, that's probably a kind of moment we can finish on, although of course there's always the question of how, and we really can't go into this, but how the development of an identity or of a sense of transgender emerges in a child. And that's always, it seems to me to be a difficult set of questions for the cis community.
I'm blanking on her full name. The last name's Peterson, The Transgender Child. Excellent book. Looking into that.
All right, okay. That's wonderful. Okay, so the author is Peterson, The Transgender Child.
Yeah.
And we can have a look at that and invite viewers to have a look at that, and I will certainly do that and gain some knowledge and education. I want to say thank you very much to Kelvin and to Zavia for sharing with us your insights and your experiences as trans people. And I want to thank you as viewers for watching again, for the time you spend with Boston Media Theory. Please feel free to share it when you see it on YouTube or elsewhere, and on NewTV here in Newton in Massachusetts. And until next time, it's me, Marcus Breen, saying thank you and keep on mediaing.